The Shroud of Turin is one of the most controversial relics in history. And besides its obscure origins, we have a physical object that many think is the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, while many others think that it is a medieval forgery. But what if something else is the truth? And that is what we'll explore on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Now, the Shroud of Turin is a very controversial item. It has been a Roman Catholic artifact, relic, that many people in, say, the Western Church think is the real burial cloth of Jesus Christ. And even some Protestants think that. For example, Gary Habermas has claimed that the Shroud of Turin is the original burial cloth of Jesus Christ, although recently he has expressed doubts and reservations. And in the 1960s, carbon-14 tests seem to have indicated that it's an artifact that originated in the 14th century AD. Now, I think that the dichotomy of, is this a artifact, genuine artifact, or is this a forgery, in some ways asks the wrong questions. So what we're going to do is we're going to explore some issues that I've discovered in my examination of the artifact. I haven't examined it in person. I've only examined photographs, but there's been some things that have sort of raised red flags that point to one thing or the other, which I think we're going to bring up here and sort of discuss, that lead to a different conclusion than most people expect. So, let's get into this. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the historic origins, okay? Now, the pedigree of the shroud is surrounded in mystery. It was claimed to have been in the possession of an Eastern Orthodox church until Constantinople was sacked in 1204 AD. The first historical record of the shroud is its appearance in the village of Lirey in France in the 1350s. And it should be noted that even in this point in time, some people, for example, Antipope Clement VII, believed it was a forgery. And we're going to ask the question today, was he right? Was he right? Now, we do have to understand, too, that Constantinople is a long ways from Jerusalem. It's if they had retrieved this from Jerusalem, then there might be at least a claim of propinquity between the crucifixion of Jesus Christ and the shroud. But the fact that they retrieved this from Constantinople does raise some issues. But we're not going to address those issues. There's other things about the physical artifact itself that I think requires at least some proper explanation. The first thing we're going to talk about here is the whole idea of a genuine artifact versus a forgery versus a misunderstood artifact. Because I think that is sort of undergirds this issue here. Genuine artifact is an artifact that's claimed to be something and is actually that thing. So you go on to a dig, you recover a pot in the ground, you understand what that pot is, you understand its context, and you claim it to be of that period because you've got evidence to warrant that that's a genuine artifact. A forgery is something else. Is done by a modern person, or even perhaps a forger in the past, to misrepresent something else. In this particular case, the idea here would be that somebody created a shroud to deceive. Now, those are two categories, the forgery versus the genuine, are two categories of items. But they're not the only categories of items. And we have to be careful here not to fall into a black or white fallacy. Because it's just not only two options here. Okay? We have other categories as well. I mean, there is, of course, the historical forgery. A genuine forgery from the past. Okay? Somebody who forged something else to try to pass it off as something more valuable, but it is historically important. Technically speaking, if the Shroud of Turin is a forgery, it is a historical forgery. A real forgery from the past. But there's yet another category, what's called misunderstood artifacts. These are genuine artifacts whose context is misunderstood. So, for example, let's say something shows up on the antiquities market and it's just sort of misidentified. It's misidentified, say the date's wrong, the artifact's being misread somehow, or was done in a later context, but it was genuine under its original context and circumstances. So we have a variety of categories that, say, an artifact like the Shroud of Turin could fall into. Okay? So now, let's get into my observations and what I've ultimately concluded about the Shroud of Turin. Now, there's a tool that's used in archaeology that's called Dstretch. And what Dstretch does is it's keyed in to identify the presence of red ochre from the surrounding matrix. Now, red ochre is essentially iron oxide. It's rust. And one of the things about Dstretch that's really interesting is it can tell the difference between the wavelength of light that comes off of red ochre versus other iron pigments. For example, hemoglobin. Now, one of the things about heme, which is the iron complex of blood, is it doesn't oxidize to a red color. Heme oxidizes to a black color. So, like for example, the loss of blood eventually turns black. It doesn't stay red. And Dstretch is a computer program that can differentiate between heme, oxidized heme, and red ochre. So when I took the full color photo of the Shroud of Turin and passed it through processing through Dstretch, I noticed large amounts of red ochre on the shroud. Okay. So this is not the presence of blood. This is the presence of red ochre. And this is a well-established tool in the field of archaeology that's used to read, say, faded ochre paintings off the sides of temple walls, off the sides of, say, stone quarries. It's a well-practiced and well-vetted tool. And here we can see in the bright purple on this Shroud of Turin here, red ochre. So there's an issue here that this has been heavily painted over. If there's been any sort of original here, it's completely been covered by red ochre. There's a light wash of red ochre over it, and with definitely highlights of red ochre. So that's an issue. The second issue is the orthographic projection problem and the skin map issue. Now, what are we talking about here? When a burial shroud was done in the 1st century, it was completely wrapped around the person. So the shroud is not just laid over. Not laid over like a drop cloth. It's wrapped. That means that when it is unwrapped, any sort of image that would have been placed on it from the inside would be flattened out from a 3D to a 2D image. The problem here with, say, the Shroud of Turin is that the orthographic projection on the cloth does not look like a proper 3D conversion. It looks more like, say, as if someone photographed it on. Like someone from a distant, took a point of photography. Now, anyone who's done, say, video game mods or done 3D models of human beings is aware of skin texture maps. And when you do a skin texture map on a 3D skeletal image, the way that it's mapped onto that, because of the orthographic projection problem, when it's in 2D, the skin of the person looks like a squashed walrus. Okay? And that's and this is a problem not just of, say, mapping skin textures to human beings, but we find this orthographic projection problem all over the place. Like, for example, it's a classic issue for maps of the world, maps of the globe. The world is a globe. You should know that by now. But turning a globe into a map distorts the image. So no 2D map that you have is a perfect representation of the globe. It's going to be bigger in some places and smaller in others. And that's because you can't completely convert a 3D image to a 2D image. There's always going to be distortions that result. So that if you wrap, I mean, you can do this yourself at home. You know, let's say you want to make a boot, a shoe. Okay, you start wrapping newspaper around your foot and your leg up to your knee. Okay, and you tape it, you do it with newsprint, you tape it up, and then you want to make a pattern for your shoe. Okay, so what you do is you wrap your foot up to your knee in your newspaper and masking tape, and then you make a pattern, and you cut that pattern off, and you flatten it. Does it still look like a foot? No, it doesn't look like a foot anymore. And that's because you've now converted the 3D sort of outline of your foot, 3D sort of contour of your foot and your leg into a flat image. And any seamstress knows this. Any seamstress knows that a pattern doesn't look like the final dress or shirt, because there's a difference between how something is done on a flat 2D surface, on the flat 2D pattern, versus its final wrapping on the 3D image, okay, on the body itself. So the fact that the Shroud of Turin looks like a 2D image instead of a squashed walrus is a significant problem, especially given how ancient Judeans wrapped people for burial. So that's my second issue with the Shroud of Turin. But we're not done yet here. There's a third problem that I noticed, which is what I can call the artistic proportion problem. Now, if you've done any sort of classical training in art, in drawing human body, there's a key principle that you have, and manga artists know this. Okay, this is well known to manga artists. Okay, it's well known to classical artists, those who have been trained in the classical method of fine art, that the human body is between 6 and 7 heads tall. Okay, including the head itself. Comic book artists will say draw us like superheroes, like Superman. 7, sometimes rarely 8 heads tall. Okay? And that's considered to be a really robust, stout human being, somebody who's like 7, 8 heads tall. The problem with the Shroud of Turin is that the image of the body on the shroud is 10 heads tall. The proportion of the head of the image is much, much smaller than a normal human being's. Okay. The other really strange thing about the head, too, is that the eyes occur in the top third of the head. So he's got a really, really tiny forehead. Classical artists also know that the eyes occur in the center of the head, not in the top third of the head. Okay? So this was not done by an artist who was particularly skilled. So he is used, whoever did the shroud tried to allude to certain properties of humanness, but failed in the details. No human being is 10 heads tall. No human being is like this. This is just bizarre. And the image on the shroud is not exceptionally tall. It's under 6 feet. So this would be a very, very bizarre looking human being in life. So that's a problem. Okay. So this leads us to the issue of what kind of artifact is this? What are we dealing with? Is this the forgery? Is this the genuine article? Or is this, say, a misunderstood artifact? Okay. Well, I'm going to say this right up. It's not the Shroud of Jesus Christ. The evidence that we've seen so far, I'm not even including the carbon-14 evidence here. The other evidence just seems to preclude this from being the original Shroud of Jesus Christ. Okay. The fact that it has been painted with ochre is not helpful. The fact that it doesn't properly orthographically project that 2D image to a 3D image, and the fact that the artistic proportions here present a human being that is so out of proportion as to be unhuman sort of precludes this from being the genuine Shroud of Jesus Christ. That just leaves us two options. Is it a forgery, or is it a misunderstood artifact? Now, we do know that during the 14th century, 12th, 13th, 14th century, a lot of artifacts entered Europe from the Holy Land through the Crusades. So there's a lot of those artifacts still in Europe today that arrived in Europe through the Crusades. And we do know, at least we have relatively good reason to believe, that this came from Constantinople, from an Eastern Orthodox church. So then we have to look at, say, then, what is something about Eastern Orthodoxy that where a shroud would be, say, part of the ritual. And interestingly enough, if you've been to an Eastern Orthodox church, one of the things you'll notice if you hang around there long enough for, say, Christmas or Easter, particularly Easter, is almost every Eastern Orthodox church has an artifact, a religious implement, called a shroud. And it's brought out once a year for a particular ceremony, which is the whole sort of the mourning of Jesus Christ. Now, so this is basically kind of similar to, say, in Ethiopian Christianity, where all the churches have a tebah, an ark. It's part of their religious ceremonies. Now, there are so many arks running around Ethiopia, it's not even funny. And the one at St. Mary's is by no means unique. Every Ethiopian Orthodox church has a tebah. It's part of the ritual life of their local churches. Likewise, every Eastern Orthodox church has a shroud. The one in our local Eastern Orthodox church is made of velvet and is sewn with beads. It's not painted, but it has the outline of Jesus Christ in beads. Okay? So this has become a standard religious implement used in Eastern Orthodox churches. Going back how long? We will never know. Nevertheless, it seems likely that the church that was plundered by the Crusaders at Constantinople was one of these shrouds that was being used in an Eastern Orthodox ritual life. And it's not the only one that has appeared in Europe. The Shroud of Turin is not alone. More than one of these appeared in Europe after the Crusades. So what we have overall here is a misunderstood artifact. The Shroud of Turin is genuine, but it isn't a genuine Eastern Orthodox ritual shroud, not the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. So it is a genuine artifact, but it is a misunderstood artifact. And it is an artifact of Eastern Orthodoxy, not an artifact that originates from the time of the apostles. So, anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned something, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And we'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.